3:09 a.m. Western Pacific. At an altitude of 35,786 kilometers in geosynchronous orbit above the equator, a U.S. Air Force space-based infrared system satellite completed its 4,017th hour of uninterrupted operation without incident. 11 seconds later, it stopped transmitting. The signal loss was registered at Space Delta IV's operations floor in Colorado at 3:09:14 a.m. Initial automated classification, telemetry anomaly. Standard protocol called for a 40-second wait before escalating to a potential on-orbit incident classification. The wait protocol existed because telemetry anomalies were common. Thermal cycling, attitude control adjustments, antenna pointing transitions all produced brief signal interruptions that resolved without intervention. At the 38-second mark, the satellite's backup telemetry channel also went silent. At 40 seconds, the on-duty crew shift lead overrode the automated wait and classified the event as an on-orbit incident at 3:09:54 a.m. In the following 90 seconds, two more SBIRS satellites registered anomalous signal degradation. Not complete loss. Partial degradation. Signal strength reduced to between 14 and 31% of nominal on primary channels, with backup channels fluctuating. The pattern was not consistent with any natural phenomenon in the space environment database. Solar particle events produce simultaneous broad-spectrum effects across all satellites in a given orbital arc. What was being recorded at 3:09 a.m. was selective. 3 satellites affected, the others nominal. The degradation profile consistent with directed interference rather than environmental cause. At 3:10:44 a.m., the Space Delta IV commander initiated the on-orbit incident protocol and transmitted a priority alert to Space Operations Command, U.S. Spacecom, and Indo-Pacific Command simultaneously. The alert's preliminary assessment used the classification language that had been formally added to the protocol 18 months earlier. Potential adversary counterspace activity. The SBIRS degradation was the first event. It was not, by the time the alert was transmitted, the only one. At 3:10:02 a.m., 52 seconds before the Space Delta IV alert, the U.S. Air Force GPS Master Control Station at Schriever Space Force Base in Colorado had begun registering anomalous signal interference reports from GPS Block 3 satellites over the Western Pacific sector. Not satellite failure, ground receiver interference. The signals being transmitted by the satellites were intact. The signals being received by military and commercial users in a geographic zone covering approximately 4.8 million square kilometers of the Western Pacific, including Guam, the Northern Mariana Islands, parts of the Philippine Sea, and the eastern approaches to the Taiwan Strait, were not. The interference was broadband, high power, and consistent with ground-based jamming systems operating from multiple coordinated transmitter arrays. The GPS denial zone was not a side effect of another operation. It was the operation. The PLA Strategic Support Force's electronic countermeasure systems had been deployed to 3 prepared positions in the Fujian coast region and on 2 of the South China Sea artificial island platforms over the preceding 11 days, under the cover designation of Communications Upgrade Equipment. The deployment had been observed by U.S. intelligence satellites but assessed as infrastructure maintenance. The signal profile of the equipment in transit had not matched any known electronic warfare system in the intelligence community's library. It matched now. The broadband interference signature that Schriever was receiving at 3:10:02 a.m. was the operational signature of a system that had not been in the library because it had not been used before. At 3:11:17 a.m., the GPS denial zone's eastern boundary moved. The zone expanded by approximately 340 kilometers in 45 seconds. A coordinated increase in transmitter power across all 5 ground sites simultaneously, pushing the denied coverage deeper into the Pacific. The expansion placed Andersen Air Force Base on Guam inside the zone's outer boundary. Not fully denied, Guam's GPS receivers were still functioning at approximately 67% accuracy. But 67% accuracy in a precision munitions environment was not a planning figure. It was a degradation figure. Every GPS-guided munition fired from Guam in the next operational period would have its circular error probable expanded by a factor that varied from 2.3 to 4.1 depending on the specific weapon system's GPS dependency level. The commercial aviation impact was immediate and visible. 12 commercial flights transiting the affected sector at the moment the GPS denial zone activated received simultaneous navigation system alerts on their primary flight management computers. 3 of the 12 were operating in airspace where the degradation reduced their navigation accuracy below the minimum threshold required for the oceanic track system they were using. Air traffic control at Tokyo ARTCC and Oakland ARTCC received simultaneous pilot requests for alternate track assignments at 3:11:44 a.m., 42 seconds after the zone activated. The rerouting coordination required 14 minutes and affected 27 flights before the zone boundary had been established with sufficient clarity for traffic management decisions. The commercial disruption was a secondary effect of the PLA's operation, not its purpose. But it was real, it was immediate, and it was the kind of cascading consequence that made GPS denial operations more strategically significant than their technical description suggested. The kinetic phase began at 3:12:44 a.m. The space-based infrared system operating at degraded capacity through its remaining functional satellites registered the launch signatures from the Eastern Theater Command's Yongan and Leaping complexes in Fujian province. DF-26b intermediate-range ballistic missiles, 6 of them, on trajectories resolving toward Andersen Air Force Base and the nearby Apra Harbor Naval Facility on Guam. Simultaneously, from the fiery Cross Reef platform in the South China Sea, YJ-12 supersonic anti-ship cruise missile signatures activated, 4 missiles, trajectories consistent with targeting the sea approaches to Guam's harbor. And from Mischief Reef, 6 CH-4 and TB-001 long-endurance drone systems activated and began ingress profiles toward the island. The detection was degraded. The SBIRS constellation was operating at reduced capacity. The partial loss of 3 satellites had reduced the infrared coverage redundancy over the Western Pacific sector, and the trajectory resolution time for the DF-26b tracks was running at 62 seconds instead of the standard 38. 24 seconds of additional uncertainty during which the fire control system's engagement solution had a wider error bar than normal operating conditions produced. At the AD Battery Alpha at Andersen Air Force Base, the battery's AN/TPY-2 radar was tracking the DF-26b tracks through its own active sensor independently of the space-based architecture. The ground-based radar was not dependent on GPS for its fire control solution. It used its own precision timing reference and inertial measurement system. The GPS degradation affected the THAAD battery's communications data links and its ability to receive off-site targeting updates from the Cooperative Engagement Capability Network, but its core intercept function remained intact. The battery commander had been briefed at shift change 2 hours earlier on the elevated readiness indicators that had been accumulating for 72 hours. He had not reduced his crew's readiness status at any point. THAAD launched against the first 2 DF-26b tracks at 3:14:01 a.m., 1 minute and 17 seconds after detection. The GPS-degraded operating environment affected the data link latency between the battery and the Aegis ships in Guam's harbor, adding 1.3 seconds to the Cooperative Engagement Capability update cycle. The fire control solution was based primarily on the AN/TPY-2's own track data. Both first-wave interceptors achieved successful guidance. Both tracks were neutralized at altitudes of 97 and 103 kilometers respectively. The next 4 DF-26b tracks were in the mid-course phase. 2 were assigned to Aegis BMD, USS Milius, operating in the Philippine Sea east of Guam, had maintained its own independent tracking solution throughout the engagement and was within SM-3 Block 2A range of the remaining tracks. USS Milius's Aegis system was operating on its internal reference timing, independent of the compromised GPS signal environment. Its fire control solution was not significantly degraded. SM-3 launched at 3:14:48 a.m. 2 tracks intercepted. 2 remained. Those 2 were met by the second THAAD salvo at 3:15:22 a.m. 1 intercept confirmed at 87 kilometers altitude. 1 THAAD interceptor lost its tracking solution when its guidance data link from the AN/TPY-2 experienced a 2.1 second interruption caused by a power fluctuation in the battery's communication system. A fault unrelated to the GPS jamming. A maintenance-deferred hardware issue in the communications rack that had been on the scheduled maintenance list for 19 days. The interceptor's autonomous terminal guidance attempted to reacquire, but the geometry had deteriorated. The DF-26B continued to terminal phase. The Patriot Pac-3 MSE battery at Anderson engaged the terminal phase DF-26B at 3:15:51 a.m. The PAC-3's active radar seeker is GPS independent in its terminal guidance phase. Once the seeker acquires the target, it homes on its own radar return regardless of the external signal environment. The PAC-3 intercepted the DF-26B at 19 kilometers altitude at 3:16:03 a.m. Fragment debris impacted the vegetation line 800 meters northeast of Anderson's primary runway. 5 of 6 DF-26B tracks intercepted. 1 intercepted at terminal phase by PAC-3 after the mid-layer missed. The YJ-12 anti-ship cruise missiles from Fiery Cross Reef were the next engagement layer. 4 supersonic cruise missiles, Mach 2 terminal velocity, sea skimming profile, targeting the harbor approaches. USS Milius's Aegis system acquired all 4 tracks at 3:13:55 a.m. and assigned SM-6. In terminal intercept mode, the SM-6's active radar terminal seeker operated independently of GPS. 3 tracks were intercepted at ranges between 45 and 62 kilometers from the harbor entrance. 1 YJ-12 executed an evasive maneuver at 3:15:44 a.m. that took it briefly below USS Milius's radar horizon due to sea clutter at low altitude. CRAM on the harbor defense vessel USS Devastator engaged the reacquired track at 3:16:11 a.m. and neutralized it at 8 kilometers from the harbor entrance. The harbor was undamaged. The drone package from Mischief Reef, 6 long-endurance platforms carrying electro-optical and synthetic aperture radar payloads, not ordnance, was a different problem. They were not inbound as precision-guided systems. They were inbound as sensors. The PLA's intention with the drone package was persistent intelligence collection over Guam's post-engagement status, damage assessment, force disposition, operational tempo indicators, real-time intelligence on how Guam was responding. The drones were unarmed. Engaging them required a deliberate decision to fire on unarmed systems in international airspace. The decision was made at Indopacom at 3:18:44 a.m. and delegated to the on-scene commander. The legal basis was clear. Unarmed collection platforms penetrating the air defense identification zone of a U.S. territory during an active engagement sequence, providing real-time intelligence to an adversary actively conducting operations against that territory. F-22s from Anderson's alert detachment had been airborne since the GPS denial zone activation at 3:10 a.m. They intercepted the drone formation at 3:21:14 a.m., 220 kilometers northwest of Guam. All 6 drones were neutralized between 3:21:14 and 3:22:41 a.m. The PLA received no post-engagement imagery from the Mischief Reef platform. The kinetic defense phase was complete by 3:22:41 a.m., 13 minutes and 27 seconds after the first satellite signal loss. 5 of 6 ballistic missile tracks intercepted. 4 of 4 anti-ship cruise missiles intercepted. 6 ISR drones neutralized. Andersen Air Force Base undamaged. Apra Harbor undamaged. U.S. personnel injuries, 0. The GPS denial zone remained active. The GPS jamming was the component of the operation that could not be solved in 13 minutes. The kinetic phase had been absorbed. The electronic phase was a sustained condition that required a different response architecture operating on a different timeline. At 3:23 a.m., the GPS denial zone still covered 4.8 million square kilometers of the Western Pacific. Every precision-guided system in that zone was operating with expanded circular error probability. Every navigation system dependent on GPS positioning was degraded. The commercial aviation routes over the Philippine Sea had already been rerouted by 3 separate air traffic control centers. Responding to navigation advisory notices issued at 3:11 a.m., the U.S. response to the GPS jamming operated on 2 tracks simultaneously. The first was technical, activating the military's GPS anti-jam capability on all platforms operating in the zone, switching weapon systems to their alternative guidance modes where available, and repositioning assets that could operate outside the denial zone's boundary. JDAM munitions, GPS-guided bombs, shifted to their inertial-only guidance backup modes. The circular error probable for inertial-only JDAM increased from approximately 3 meters to approximately 19 meters. For most target categories, 19 meters remained operationally acceptable. For a specific subset of high-precision targets requiring sub-5-meter accuracy, it was not. The second track was offensive. The ground-based jamming systems on the Fujian coast and on Fiery Cross and Mischief Reef were now the priority target set. Operation Clear Sky activated at 3:24 a.m. under pre-delegated authority from INDOPACOM. The targeting package had been maintained for 14 months specifically for adversary ground-based GPS denial systems. 3 B-2 Spirit aircraft that had been airborne over the Pacific since 10 p.m. the previous evening were vectored to their ingress corridors at 3:24 a.m. Each carried GBU-28 bunker-penetrating precision munitions with laser terminal guidance, not GPS-dependent in their final guidance phase. The Fujian coast jamming arrays were co-located with existing PLA electronic facilities on relatively accessible terrain. The artificial island platforms were hardened but compact. The entire Fiery Cross Reef military installation fit within a footprint of approximately 2.8 square kilometers. F-35 Sea aircraft from USS Carl Vinson, operating east of the GPS denial zone's boundary, received clear sky targeting packages at 3:26 a.m. The F-35C's targeting pod uses laser and infrared guidance in its precision engagement modes. GPS provides position awareness, but the terminal engagement is not GPS dependent. 8 F-35Cs crossed the GPS denial zone boundary at 3:31 a.m. operating on inertial navigation updates. Their position accuracy degraded at approximately 0.8 nautical miles per hour of inertial-only navigation, manageable over a 40-minute ingress to targets on the artificial island platforms. The Fiery Cross Reef jamming array received its first ordnance at 3:47 a.m. AGM-158BJASSMER with GPS inertial composite guidance, the inertial component maintaining 94% of nominal accuracy even within the denial zone. The GPS denial from Fiery Cross Reef went offline at 3:47:31 a.m. as the array's power and communications infrastructure was rendered non-operational. The denial zone's southwestern boundary retracted immediately. The coverage reduction was visible in real time on the GPS monitoring systems at Schriever. Within 4 minutes, the zone's area had contracted by approximately 22% as the Fiery Cross contribution to the jamming architecture was removed. The Mischief Reef array was engaged at 3:51 a.m. Another 18% zone contraction. The Fujian coast arrays, 3 separate sites on Chinese sovereign territory were the harder problem. Engaging fixed military infrastructure on Chinese mainland territory required a different authorization level than engaging systems on international maritime features. The authorization process had been running since 3:24 a.m. in parallel with the F-35C ingress. It was completed at 3:44 a.m., 20 minutes from INDOPACOM request to National Command Authority authorization. The B-2s reached their weapon release points at 3:53 a.m. All 3 Fujian coast sites were engaged between 3:53 and 3:56 a.m. The GPS denial zone collapsed entirely at 3:56:44 a.m. 47 minutes of GPS degradation over the Western Pacific. Every system in the zone had been operating on backup guidance modes for 47 minutes. At 3:58 a.m., the SBIRS satellites that had been experiencing degraded signal output began recovering. 2 restored full signal strength within 11 minutes of the GPS denial zone collapse. The degradation had been produced by a directed energy dazzling system co-located with one of the Fujian coast jamming arrays, not by physical damage to the satellites. Dazzling produces temporary sensor saturation without permanent damage. The satellite was never non-functional. Its infrared sensors had been temporarily saturated by a high-power laser system and had defaulted to a protective mode that reduced output while the saturation condition persisted. With the laser system no longer operating, the saturation cleared. The 3rd satellite, which had experienced complete signal loss, remained offline. Post-incident analysis would determine whether its loss was dazzling, a co-orbital interceptor, or a pre-positioned system that had been activated from a ground station. That determination would take days. The operational consequence at 3:58 a.m. was that 2 of 3 degraded satellites were back online, and the constellation's coverage was approaching nominal. The recovery of GPS accuracy over the Pacific sector was not instantaneous following the denial zone collapse. The GPS constellation's position signals were intact throughout. The satellites had been transmitting correctly for the full 47 minutes. What needed to recover was the receiver-side accuracy estimation across the thousands of military and commercial systems that had switched to degraded modes. Military receivers with cached position data began reconverging on accurate solutions within 60 to 90 seconds of the jamming cessation. Commercial aviation flight management systems required between 2 and 4 minutes to re-establish position accuracy sufficient for primary navigation use. The oceanic track system that had been operating on backup procedures since 3:11 a.m. was restored to normal operations at 3:59:14 a.m. 2 minutes and 30 seconds after the jamming ended. Total timeline from first satellite signal loss to GPS denial zone collapse: 47 minutes, 44 seconds. Total timeline from first SBIRS detection of ballistic launch to completion of all kinetic defensive engagements: 13 minutes, 27 seconds. Clear Sky Ordnance Expenditure 4B2GBU 28 packages 8JASSMER from F-35C platforms 4SM-3 from USS Milius 2 THAAD first wave 2 THAAD second wave 4 SM-6 terminal intercept 1 CRAM. Total Clear Sky counter-operation ordnance cost $312 million. DF-26B tracks launched 6. Intercepted 5 across 3 layers. Terminal phase intercept required 1. Anderson runway undamaged. Apra Harbor undamaged. J-12 anti-ship missiles launched 4. All 4 intercepted. PLA ISR drones, 6 of 6 neutralized before reaching collection orbit. U.S. personnel injuries, 0. SBIRS satellites partially recovered 2 of 3. 3rd satellite status assessment ongoing. GPS denial zone, collapsed at 3:56:44 a.m. Operational GPS accuracy restored 3:57 a.m. The operation had been designed around a single insight that the PLA's planning architecture had spent 4 years developing. Kinetic defense could absorb a missile salvo, but absorbing a missile salvo while operating in a denied electromagnetic environment was a different problem. The GPS denial was not support to the kinetic phase. It was the primary effort. The kinetic phase was support to the GPS denial, designed to force the defensive architecture to operate in degraded mode at the moment when its engagement solutions mattered most. The insight was correct. The DF-26B that had required a PAC-3 terminal intercept had required it because a communications fault had interrupted a THAAD guidance data link at a critical moment. A fault that the GPS degradation had not caused, but that the GPS degradation had made more consequential. In a fully nominal electromagnetic environment, the Cooperative Engagement Capability Network would have provided a backup guidance update that compensated for the communications interruption. In a degraded GPS environment, that backup path was slower by 1.3 seconds. The 1.3-second delay had not caused the miss. The communications fault had caused it. But the degraded environment had removed one of the redundancy layers that would otherwise have compensated. The PLA's operational logic had found the seam. What it had not found was a seam wide enough to matter. The defense had held. The GPS denial had lasted 47 minutes and been answered by a counter-operation that removed the denial architecture systematically while the kinetic defense ran in parallel. The seam existed. The architecture that operated through it was deep enough that finding the seam had not been sufficient.